Welcome to Lights On MOR. This is a interview series we'll be doing with authors in management and organization review to learn more about what their ideas are and how they got to those ideas. And today we have with us Ron Burt, who's the Charles Hopper Professor of Sociology and Strategy at University of Chicago, and also professor at Bocconi School of Management in Milan, Italy. And also Sonja Opper, Professor of International Management, Bocconi School of Management in Italy. Today we'll be talking about your paper in MOR that was from 2017 titled Early Network Events and in the Later Success of Chinese Entrepreneurs. So let me start off just by asking about some background. So Sonja, I know you've published a lot on China and are fluent in Chinese. How did you get involved in studying about China?
I actually started out as an undergraduate as an economist. So I studied economics, and early on I was drawn to emerging and developing countries and economies. And at that time was a time when the transition economies were a big theme. I'm from Germany, so it was a big topic to think about transition economies, and China was clearly the most fascinating among them. And then learning Chinese seemed to be a rational thing to do if you want to have a proper understanding of the data and the analysis.
And how long? I know you were in Taiwan for a while studying Chinese. Where else were you studying?
I studied economics and Chinese in Germany at Tübingen University, and I spent 1 year in Taiwan at Taipei Shifan Dashi.
And Ron, how did you get interested in China?
I've always been drawn to good work in management, and I happened on this book at the presentation of the Terry Award from the Academy of Management, which celebrated the book. And then Anne Sui asked me to make some comments on it at an ICMR conference. And I just loved the book. And I thought what it really needed was some network data along with the network metaphors that are so rich in it. And Sonja was very open to this, and she was funding the work. So there we go. It seemed a real opportunity.
Yeah, and it produced an amazing article. Well, let me launch into that article and ask, what led you to focus on founding events for Chinese entrepreneurs?
What always stuck with me was the stories entrepreneurs told about founding. It was, in just general sense, the founding is an important part of getting a firm started, but there seemed to be something specific about the founding. People were talking about specific relations. It was the very trusted person that was involved. It was reference to a brother or a long-term friend. So when we started to analyze the data, I actually went right away to the founding story and expecting something special to occur there.
So it sounds like you were already interviewing entrepreneurs for a broader project, and then after your interviews, it narrowed down to this focus.
Yeah. The book that Ron just showed was drawing on survey data from 2006 and 2009. And at that time, we had no network data, but the intuition and the metaphor that you see in the book, that networks matter, guanxi matter, relational ties. And this was a springboard for Ron to get involved, to say there is an analytic way to get to these metaphors.
Well, that's a great lead into the methods, because you added the perspective of network analysis to what you had been doing before. If you read through the paper, it's an astonishing data accomplishment. How did that process work? How did you get this rich database of all these contacts between entrepreneurs and their founders, friends, family relations? How did that all get accomplished?
That's a wonderful pair of questions, Ray, because The study itself is an illustration of the theory in the study, which is the power of brokerage. Sonja and I had not worked together. We didn't know one another. I was specializing in the analytics of networks, and she was specializing in the substance of China. But I had found in studying women who had graduated from the University of Chicago that the history of their network mattered for their current existence, not surprisingly. But on reading Capitalism from Below, I thought, here's a situation where the history would not only be interesting, but probably be critical in understanding it. So a methodology used in the alumni survey was to sketch a timeline. And in this case, in the case of the entrepreneurs, it was you founded the business here. We're now in 2012 or 2018 in the subsequent surveys. And then given how flexible memory can be, you've got to trigger that carefully. And so you'd have a timeline, you'd cut the line in half and then cut it in half again, and then ask them about specific events. And that way they can ground them in real time. And then we can ask them who was key in this event or the next event. And then we just used the usual methodology, but it was framed in terms of this stylized timeline for their business. And what it meant is we dragged the network back to the beginning of the business. And then we could populate that timeline with key contacts during key events. And it worked beautifully. It's a very simple procedure. It's one page, but it yields just a phenomenal amount of very reliable data.
How did the entrepreneurs you contacted react when you asked them to do this?
Let's take this in two parts. I'll make a stab at that, and then you'll have more substance on it. My experience with the alumna and then with the entrepreneurs, I was not there, so I can't say the same way I can with the alumna. People loved it because what they're doing is describing things that matter. Now, if I was to ask them who's been important over the history of the business, everything's mushed all together. It's hard. But if I ask, on your 21st birthday party, who was the person who brought the cake to you? Yeah, then that's a thing. Who was the person who helped you found the business? When you lost your supplier, who was the person who helped you find another one? These are key events. You feel a debt to these people, and it's sort of fun to talk about. A person was a nice person. I knew they were good, but this was just wonderful.
Yeah, just to add on the fun part, in terms of response rate and all the other issues one has with surveys, I would say that actually the components that were not standard surveys found more approval among entrepreneurs because it was just different. We've run the network survey, and we have also brought in field experiments. Those is a part that is more actually interesting and down to earth for the entrepreneur. So I definitely confirm what Ron just said. In terms of the implementation, of course, this required really careful training. And we were very fortunate to cooperate with a good survey company, which was able to do this in a comparable way, because ultimately, obviously, 700 entrepreneurs, we were not able to interview them all in person. So we had to rely on a team, and we had to train a team to do this in a comparable way.
Well, let's switch to the ideas in the paper. There were some things that I think were really fascinating. I'll just start off with, a broad question about there's so much in the paper that it's hard to narrow down, but if you were going to look at what you think is the most important kind of point of the paper, what would you highlight?
For me, the highlight in the paper is the importance of close ties early on in the founding, and then the importance to shift out of those. Most people started out with these very close people, but then you saw this huge variation. Some always stayed close, and after 15 years of business, you were visiting a very small traditional entrepreneurial firm. But this was those people who lived in these closed networks, who always went back to their initial contacts and never sort of broadened their network. Whereas those people who ended up with relatively large firms, yes, they also started out with their best friend and a close friend of both of them. But then suddenly it became professionalized. This switch from the traditional start to the professionalization is something that is very clear in this paper. And I think that's a very interesting point to take away from it as an entrepreneurial lesson. And I think it applies not just in China, but also elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, there was one figure which was fascinating that showed how close those ties were in the early events, and then it kind of comes down very quickly after that, showing how distinctive the network is for the founding events. That was a very strong point in that figure.
Yeah.
And I think it makes perfect sense. Generally, even absent an uncertain institutional environment, if we're thinking about all the newness that comes with starting a new firm, you really need a person that trusts you with all what they have to believe you can pull off a company. So that person knows you for a long time, truly trusts you, doesn't need any external confirmation, and is going to help you. Put this into China's uncertain environment, where you may have institutional issues, don't get capital, there might be red tape, there might be bribery, you might have all threats around you. You need someone really close that supports you. But then you have to get out there. Otherwise, you're just going to be stuck in that type of relationship.
Great point. Yeah, Rhonda, do you want to add to this?
It's a very rich point, so there's a lot of roots into it. As complement to Sonja's observation, let me make two contrasts, one in theory and one in substance. The point in theory is that a great deal of research, some of it in MOR, has shown that network brokers do better. So the people who reach out of their closed local network into other networks have various advantages over the people who limit themselves to only a closed circle of people. But what this result shows is that people who start out right away trying to be an independent person, connecting out with other groups, don't do well. They do well after a certain adolescence has been passed. That's the image of the cocoon, where staying closed doesn't do well. Being open all the time doesn't do well. It's the mixture that does very well. An initial network of multiple interconnected supportive people, some family, but more often people you've known for a long time who know each other. How much of that is your dad's banker? I don't know, but there's this interconnected set. If you stay in that set, the business won't do very well. But if you don't have that set initially to help you get off the ground, you won't do very well either. It's when you have that set that sort of lets you grow up to a point where you're ready to be independent, and then you start launching off. That's the ideal mix. And that's where we see the incredible high performance. This is a frontier for network analysis, but interestingly, because of the importance of history in China, we see it really clearly in China in a developmental way that no other place could do. The other point I'd like to highlight is MOR. The way that the journal was being managed at the time is a mixture of definitive research results and exploratory results. And one of the complications of this paper is it has a lot of first-time exploration into new ideas. And that's never elegant. It's a little daunting because there's so much stuff going on. But this piece then informed two subsequent papers, one in MOR on the survival of businesses, which showed the same thing. Developmental cocoon leads to a longer lifetime for the business venture, but also in entrepreneurship theory and practice, another paper on network disadvantaged entrepreneurs in China, where the argument got more and more precise. So there's there's a substantive point here, but one of the things that makes it complicated is MOR's mission of launching new ideas. And I very much appreciated that.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, how the ideas were followed up on since this paper, and you started, you elaborated on that very nicely. How are the ideas being worked on currently?
Frankly, I think for myself, two types of directions developed, pretty much both inspired from these early papers we've been doing. One is work looking at the link between behavior and the network structure around the entrepreneur. A couple of papers have come out here. For instance, the question, how does a network around you inform your dealings with strangers? That's the relationship with cooperation. Are people that always live in a close network still able to reach out and trust a stranger and to cooperate, or are they, after all, avoiding this type of contact? A similar line of argument was the question of temporal preferences, with paper on network structure and temporal myopia, showing that people who are always just in their little bubble and in their closed network are a little bit losing sight of the future because they don't have various arguments they're dealing with. So they're kind of perpetuating the presence into the future, forget about long-term planning, and are really running into strategic issues.
Given the political dynamics in China right now, do you see or would you expect any significant shifts in network patterns? You can say, please pass.
No, because I do think this question is right to the point. I just think it has become much more obvious for lay observers what is going on. We've been kind of blinded by liberalized product markets, thinking China is so fairly liberal and one can live without political connections. I'm one of those who always say you can never live without political connections if you have highly regulated markets that continue to be highly regulated. And this has always been the case for the capital market, for the stock market, for the land use market. You don't even have to go to public tenders. Now, what the difference is that the Chinese government also targets its previous superstar entrepreneurs like Jack Ma. Now that the technology sector has been catching up and is at the frontier. And it shows that political connections also can be devalued, so that it's not a guarantee and a robust system. But I think we have seen this in other areas for quite a while. So I don't find it too novel. I think it's the extent to which the government has been acting over the last year that is new and has moved more into the public eye.
Ron, did you have a comment on these last two questions?
Again, Sonja's sketched a substantively rich tableau. I think two things hit me on with respect to your question. This particular paper highlights that long-term ties have the quality of guanxi, in the sense that once I know you, I don't need other people telling me you're a good person. I know you're a good person, yeah, because I've had experience with you. And this turns on various analyses of once you've been through an event with someone and they've been trustworthy, you sort of expect that they will be trustworthy into the future. The two ways that trust happens are dense networks create a reputation cost so that people would avoid bad behavior because it'll be found out and no one will have anything to do with them. That leads us into economics, political science, sociology. The element that China brings in is this idea of guanxi, and the results in this first paper that were elaborated in a very popular paper with Yanji Bian in Social Networks from this paper is that these event contacts tend to be people that you don't have a lot of third-party connections with. They are long-term ties that come out of history. And I came to trust you, not because there's a lot of other people watching you, so I know I'm safe, but because over time I've learned that you're a trustworthy person. That's all well and fine, but now think about some exogenous shock to the system. You can always adapt to exogenous shock if you're inside a closed network of people who watch one another. But if your ties depend on long-term trust, that we've had a history with one another, I don't have time to develop that kind of relation. So what we see in these Chinese entrepreneurs is that they have built ventures on top of existing networks. Now comes the interesting question. If there's an exogenous shock to the system, how quickly can they react? And it's not clear that they'll be able to react as quickly as they were able to build, because the relations were already there. In this, Western entrepreneurs have a slight advantage because they don't have the guanxi ties that sort of lock them into certain people. And the ties they have are based on building trust more quickly. And so that means they're adaptable. They can move into something and find the people I can trust. Now, I don't know how this will play out, but one of the implications of the reliance on long-term relations for trusted contacts out of this paper is a stasis, a bit of static structure to the network that we don't know how it's going to adapt to a shock. In essence, China rose up very quickly, building on existing ties. So now comes the question, what if those ties are no longer helpful to you? How quickly can you rebuild new ties? And that led us over to look at, do you trust people outside your network? And what we learned, and it was just published 2 days ago in Org Science, was that in fact, the more closed the network around you, the more likely you trust your close people, but the more you're likely to defect against anyone outside the network. And if you've been successful, you're even more likely to do that because you believe in your head that maintaining a closed circle of people is why I've been successful. And so now you get even more arrogant about defecting against people outside. This suggests that polarization is a dramatic problem, certainly in the West, if not in China. So the frontier is really rich with interesting questions that come out of the analysis of these events.
Yeah, I just want to thank you both so much for doing this interview. It's great to hear what's been going on, how you did the work, and to hear the nuances of the ideas and to think about what the future agenda will be coming out of this kind of research. It seems like tremendously promising research with lots of important implications. So I just want to say thank you, Sonja and Ron, to you both for sitting down for this Lights On MOR interview.